Happy Sabbath. How are you all? I hope you had enjoyed your week and did things that you wanted to do. And I hope you had enjoyed God's blessing. Tonight, I continue to ask the Lord to provide each one of you His joy, love, and peace, and that His Spirit will guide us tonight as we study His book. Tonight, we're going to study Genesis chapter 21. Let me start reading verse 1. The Lord visited Sarah as He had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as He had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. The Lord visited Sarah as He had said. The Hebrew word visit has the notion of remembering. Implies that God remembered His promise from the past. And you remember the name Isaac means laughter, right? Both Abraham and Sarah first laughed in disbelief when God said that they were going to have a child. But now, when Isaac was born, Sarah laughed again. But this time it's not because she didn't believe, but because she was joyous and grateful. And that's why she said, who would have said, indicating amazement, who would have believed such a supernatural, mighty act of God? And then Isaac was circumcised when he was 8 days old. Abraham remembered God's instruction. So at the right time, which was 8 days old, Isaac was circumcised. Remember, a year ago, Abraham was 99. He was instructed by the Lord that he and his descendants were to be circumcised as an outward sign of their covenant with God. So he and his household were circumcised. Abraham obeyed. Now verse 8. And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on that day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave women. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named, and I will make a nation of the son of the slave women also, because he is your offspring. Why celebrate when a child is weaned from the mother? When a child is around 3, he or she is weaned from the mother. And this is something to be celebrated about because it is an indication that this little child has survived the dangerous stage of infancy. We notice here in this passage that Ishmael laughing. There's a few laughs here in Abraham's story. Abraham and Sarah laughed when God told them that they were going to have a child of their own. They laughed because of disbelief. And then when Isaac was born, Sarah laughed because of joy and gratefulness. And now Ishmael also laughed. But this time it implies mocking. So Sarah told Abraham, get rid of that slave women. Why was Sarah so angry? Was she making a mountain out of a molehill? A little teasing does no harm, right? Well, let me explain. Hagar's status in the house of Abraham created friction. A scholar explained that her initial status was elevated as Sarah's handmaiden to a wife of Abraham when Sarah chose her as one to give an heir to Abraham. So Hagar was a wife to Abraham, not concubine, not handmaid, because Ishmael was going to be the heir. As a handmaid, both she and her child could be sold as slaves according to Sarah's wish. But all this has changed. Now Hagar was a wife to Abraham, and consequently, Sarah couldn't easily rid of her as she would rid of a servant. So she would generally have to be divorced. The term send her off is actually a Hebrew word that used for divorce. By sending her away or divorced, both Hagar's and Ishmael's previous status, wife and heir, were being dissolved. So we could see here this passage use laughter or laugh again and again. But the Ishmael laugh was not a positive one. It denotes mocking or scoffing. Sarah said, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. Sarah observes Ishmael's behavior and concludes that there is a danger for Isaac to lose his rights as the legitimate heir. In the way Ishmael mocked or played with Isaac, Ishmael was suggesting Isaac is not to be taken seriously like the meaning of his name. Remember Isaac's name? The meaning of it is laugh. For this reason, Sarah told Abraham to rid of Hagar and Ishmael. You know, the Apostle Paul seems to agree with this interpretation. Let's look at Galatians chapter 4, verse 29. But just as at that time, he who was born according to the flesh, that means Ishmael, persecuted him, Isaac, who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. Paul said Ishmael persecuted Isaac. So God spoke up, and he confirms Sarah's fear and supports her decision. According to this passage, Abraham was actually quite displeased with Sarah's demand, even angry. He hesitated, perhaps playing with the idea that, well, Ishmael may be the rightful heir. But God not only supports Sarah's request, he also insists. What did God say? In Isaac, your seed shall be called. The Hebrew word, be called, indicate a divine calling. So God voiced his agreement with Sarah. And God reminded Abraham that the seed of Isaac is the one that was set apart by God for messianic purposes. Although God will still take care of Ishmael, but it is through Isaac's gene that will lead to the Davidic line and then to the Messiah. Let's read on, verse 14. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him in a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, "Let me not look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy, and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy. And she grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with a bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran. And his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So in obedience to God, Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael off. Mother and son walked away together into the wilderness of Beersheba, which would be in the desert region of the Negev. We're told that they wandered because they had nowhere else to go. When they ran out of water in the desert, they collapsed with exhaustion, anticipating that they would soon die. God, however, intervenes and reassures Hagar that he cares for both her and Ishmael. Although God has special plan for Isaac, he did not abandon Hagar and Ishmael. Remember a few chapters ago when Hagar ran away when she had problem with Sarah? God intervened at that time and promised that she would be the mother of a great nation. You can go back and look at chapter 16, verse 10 to 12. Here it says, God heard. What wonderful words these are. There's no pain of his people that he doesn't see or hear about. God was near to deliver. The child would not die. God stepped in and sent an angel to comfort Hagar and provided a well of water for the mother and son. Furthermore, God renewed his promise to Hagar and Ishmael that Ishmael would become a great nation. So mother and son lived in the desert of Paran, and it is in the northern part of Sinai between Egypt and Canaan. God's promise was realized in Ishmael's life. He became an archer, that is, he learned to hunt. Hagar makes sure that Ishmael marry an Egyptian, one of her own people. Just like Abraham's servant searched for a wife for Isaac from among his own people. As God had promised, Ishmael was blessed also. He had 12 sons who became great rulers and eventually a nation of people. Now, we're going back to Abraham and Abimelech's relationship. This time, it's about Abraham making a treaty with Abimelech. If you recall last week, we said he was a king from Gerar who took Sarah into his harem, and God intervened. And that was in Genesis chapter 20. Now let's read on. At that time, Abimelech and Phicol the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me, or with my descendants, or with my posterity. But as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal kind with me, and with the land where you have sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. It appears from this verse that Abraham and Sarah were still living in the region of Gerar. And this commander of the army is also mentioned in the later encounter with Isaac. We'll see that in chapter 26. Well, Abimelech said, God is with you. And with these words, Abimelech and Phicol introduced the desire to form a treaty with Abraham. So what did Abimelech say? According to the kindness I have done to you, so you do to me. So what kind of kindness? The kindness he mentioned here is alluding to his previous encounter with Abraham, and that Abraham at that time dealt falsely with him in telling him a lie about his wife Sarah. But then Abimelech dealt with him in kindness. He gave him sheep, oxen, male and female servants, and he even restored Sarah, his wife, to Abraham. So Abimelech told Abraham, swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me, or with my descendants, or with my posterity. So this actually is an ancient type of oath. It's a binding obligation that cannot be broken, because he included God here. That means God would be the witness to the act, and a witness against anyone who might break it. So Abraham sweared. Verse 25. When Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servant had seized, Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart, and Abimelech said to Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart? He said, these 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for me that I dug this well. Therefore, that place was called Beersheba, because they both of them swore an oath. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistine. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. A little information about the location, Gerar. Through the Bible, we recognize Gerar was a place occupied by the Philistines, a sea people. But scholars found out that it was not until 1200 BC that the Philistine people came to that place. So later when we get to the book of Judges, we'll notice that they were the Israelites' enemy. But then in Abraham's time, around 2000 BC, the people of Philistine had not yet settled in Gerar, according to the scholar. And they agree that Abimelech was probably just a Semitic king and not a Philistine. Now let's go back to the passage. It turned out that there was a dispute between the two concerning about the well. For those who tended sheep and goats, water rights and wells matter a great deal. So Abimelech agreed to settle the issue promptly. Well, let's talk a little bit about well for those days. It was a big deal. The region of Beersheba had limited rainfall, so the water supply was largely provided through wells. Water rights in such environment were established by contracts. So water was a big deal in the ancient time. History recorded that there were water disputes and water negotiations between kings around those period of time. And contracts were drawn up of who gets what water wells. You see, digging well wasn't an easy endeavor. It required the knowing of the movement of the water, so then they could identify the location of groundwater. And then they will have to have the ability to dig deep down into those groundwater. And then they have to have the know-how to build a good well with lining that prevents leaking. And it takes a lot of manpower to dig a well. So now we can understand why Abraham was angry that Abimelech's servants just come and seize the new well that Abraham had just dug. And this passage here is the first use of the word covenant for a parity treaty. A parity treaty is a binding agreement between two equals, unlike the previous agreement between God and man. This parity treaty is similar to today's business contracts. So Abraham gave Abimelech sheep and oxen when they made this contractual agreement. And then Abraham did something extra. He presented 7 ewe lambs, that means female lambs, female sheep, to Abimelech. So what is the significance of that? You know, the Hebrew number 7 is similar in sound to the word to swear. So 7 ewe sheep sounded like swear. So he wanted Abimelech to swear. Thus, Beersheba would be the well where they swore, and the well of the 7 ewe lambs. In the next generation, during the time of Isaac, in chapter 26, we see this ritual again when Isaac make a contract with Abimelech. And then we notice this passage that Abraham called there on the Lord, the everlasting God. Abraham did more than just pray to the Lord. He made proclamation in the Lord's name, telling everyone about the Lord, the everlasting God, the master of eternity. Not only does he live forever, but he meets the needs of his people for all eternity. And Abraham planted a tamarisk tree. The tamarisk tree is an evergreen that can reach 30 feet. That's quite tall. And is ideal for providing shade. Abraham's act of planting a tree is accompanied by his prayer to God, the God that he called everlasting God. Thus, he was expressing his hope to settle permanently in that land. His prayer is heard, since the next verse tells us that Abraham sojourned in the land many days. We see here that although Abraham had been promised the whole of the land for his posterity, in his own life he lived under agreements with others in their land. So after reading this narrative, What have we observed about the character of God? I could see that God doesn't forget the promises that he had made with men and women, like the promise he made with Abraham and the promise that he made with Hagar. Also, we could see here that God protects the plan of salvation, the lineage that leads to the Messiah. Initially, Abraham didn't agree with Sarah when she wanted to expel Hagar and Ishmael. God showed up. He talked to Abraham because Abraham's decision could jeopardize the plan of salvation. Number 2 question. What does this narrative say about humanity? We often get entangled in different situations, like Abraham and Sarah with Hagar and Ishmael, like Abraham with Abimelech. But God is not far away. He is just a call away. 3rd question. What have we learned from this narrative of how we should live? Like Abraham, we need to trust God's wisdom. And when God answers our prayer, don't forget him. In this story, Abraham planted the tamarisk tree to remember the everlasting God that answered his calls. Happy Sabbath.